But what about all those manuscripts that have notes about how unreliable the last 12 verses are? Because you'll see, and I think William Barclay, Larry Richards, Norman Geisler, Bart Ehrman might say, oh, well, they basically just find different ways to rephrase what Metzger said, which is that in quite a few manuscripts, obviously I'm not quoting them exactly, but feel free to look at them. There are some manuscripts that have notes that say that some manuscripts don't have verses 9 through 20. Well, there again, the evidence is kept at arm's length, and so a lot of people that write commentaries on Mark don't tend to go into a whole lot more detail anyway. They just find another way to repeat what Metzger said, and nobody bothers to go look at the notes in detail. You can see in Manuscript 1 and Manuscript 205, about 23 manuscripts in all. They have one form of this note or another. Now as the comments go on, they got shorter. It says in some of the copies, and no, it doesn't say, as you might get the impression from Metzger, it does not say in some of the ancient copies. It just says in some of the copies, the evangelist work is finished here. And so do Eusebius Pamphilius Canons. That's the name for Eusebius of Caesarea.
Right.
And that's a reference to the Eusebian Canons. But in many, this also appears, and then they have verses 9 to 20. There's a shorter form of the note, and this probably is shorter because when this note was made, the Eusebian Canons had been expanded, and so they didn't know what to do with that claim because to them, it wasn't true. So they just didn't include it part of the note. It says, in some of the copies, the gospel is completed here, but in many, this also appears. So in none of these notes is it said, no, in the ancient copies. In fact, if you look in more detail, you can find a reference to in the older copies. It's all there. Not at all the impression that a person would get from Metzger, but there it is. And some people also say that, well, in some of the copies, I think Craig Evans is very guilty of this, of saying in some copies there are asterisks and obeli, besides 9 to 20. No. Look at the list that Dan Wallace claimed were examples of this. Each and every one is not what he says it is. It's either part of the lectionary apparatus, or it's a note that something means something other than what he assumed that it meant. So somebody is looking at these manuscripts and not understanding what they're looking at. There in slide 6, you can also see that these are not independent writers coming up with these notes. These notes are in the same cluster of manuscripts, are related to the same cluster, and it's the same note. It's not spontaneous scribes just popping up and saying, oh, let me tell you this. These notes have the same ancestry.
Right. So this note essentially has a tradition all its own that was started in one specific family of Greek manuscripts.
Yes, and that would be the Family 1 manuscripts. You can look in manuscript 1582, and I think we have that pictured right here. You can even see the lines occasionally when the note appears. You can see the lines line up.
Right.
That's not independent perpetuation. That's the same ancestry being illustrated.
So this note is always accompanied with the full text of Mark 16, 9 through 20.
Except in the case of damage. I wouldn't rule that out altogether. And also, in 1582, there was also a note next to Mark 16, 19, which pointed out that Irenaeus quoted Mark 16, 19.
That's like 1st century or 2nd century, isn't it?
Second century. Yeah. 1st century would be the Apostles, but it's still extremely early. Much earlier, more than a century earlier than Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. You could say that it's not in the earliest manuscripts, but that's because these manuscripts have the benefit of surviving. Irenaeus' manuscripts didn't have the benefit of surviving because it was probably made of papyrus, which in France, where he was at the time, it would naturally rot away.
Right.
Irenaeus was able to quote from it, and that quotation is preserved in Against Heresies, Book 3. Anybody can look it up and see the quotation there, very, very specific. And we can also look in Codex 1582 and see the reference to it in Greek. We can look at manuscript 72 and see the same reference in Greek. This is the same note. So it's not as if the earliest evidence is against Mark 16, 9 to 20. Irenaeus points out that Mark 16:19 is in his copy of the Gospel of Mark. So we have that echo of Irenaeus' manuscript. But Irenaeus is not the only early patristic writer that uses Mark 16:9-20. Now,
right.
like I said, it was widely used in the church, but there's also a claim about Clement. You see this claim. I think it's been spread and kind of parroted ever since Metzger presented it. A claim that, well, Clement of Alexandria didn't use Mark 16:9-20. Before we look at how many patristic writers did use Mark 16:9-20, let's look at Clement. If we have slide 9, we can see how much of Mark did Clement use in all of Clement's writings that we know of. How much does Clement use anything from the Gospel of Mark? Well, he uses about 1.3% of Mark outside of chapter 10. So it's like chapter 10 of Mark, he uses a bunch. But outside chapter 10, he hardly uses it at all. Not unusual at all to see Mark not being used by Clement. People look at that claim in Metzger and say, "Oh, well, that must mean he didn't have it in his text." Well, no, because Clement also does not use any text from chapter 1, from chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7,
right.
chapter 11, chapter 12, chapter 15, and chapter 16.
So if you're consistent,
that is evidence of anything.
Yeah.
Because Metzger said it, the claim has rolled on, and probably half the commentaries on Mark.
Yeah, so if you're consistent with that, then you would have to say that there is no chapter 1-7 in the Gospel of Mark, right? If you're going to suggest that Mark 16 isn't there.
Nobody treats the evidence that way about any other passage because it's so thin.
It's an argument from silence, right? Like you're saying, oh, Clement didn't quote it, so it must not have been there.
There's also what is called the shorter ending. I'd like to look at that. Slide 18 of Old Latin Codex Babiensis. We have in verse 4, which you see at the beginning of this page here, there's an interpolation in Mark 16:4, or before Mark 16:4. And part of verse 8 has been removed. So it's not like this copyist who made the Codex Babiensis was unwilling to be creative with his text. He definitely was creative with his text. We see part of verse 8 is missing, and we see a significant interpolation added in Mark 16:4, and but also we see this copyist, even though it's a Latin manuscript, he did not know Latin very well. He was not familiar with the material he was writing, but Codex Babiensis is often brought up, Codex K, but it's the one old Latin manuscript that has the shorter ending. So we know that it existed there, probably in the 400s, but the copyist. How aware was he of what he was writing? When he's writing the shorter ending, he writes, instead of the word Peter, he writes the Latin word for child.
Oh, no. Oops.
Yeah, you would think that's a bad mistake. Now, compared to some of the other mistakes they make, say, when he's writing the Lord's Prayer, that would be minor in comparison. So that's the old Latin Codex Babiensis. Now, when it comes to all the rest of the Old Latin, I think Codex A would be one that's kind of a coin that's on its edge. It wouldn't be strong evidence this way or that way. When it comes to the other Old Latin evidence, it's all in favor of Mark 16:9-20. Jerome, when he produces the Vulgate, he says, "I made this on the basis of old Greek manuscripts. I've only used the old ones." So in all the thousands of copies of the Vulgate, we have support for Mark 16:9-20. But also, not to minimize the shorter ending, we also have the shorter ending represented in Greek in Codex L in slide 19. In Codex L, we see the end of Mark in that first column on that first page. We see Mark end. Then there's a horizontal line of squarish marks. And then a note that says, "In some, there is also this." And then comes the shorter ending. That's the same thing we saw in Codex Babiensis, but now it's Greek. After that, there's a note that says, "There is also this appearing after, for they were afraid." So this second note says, there are also copies in which this appears after verse 8. So there are some that have the shorter ending. There are some that have verses 9-20 following verse 8. And then the text continues to all of Mark 16:9-20. No, there's the Amen at the end of verse 20, then the closing title to the Gospel of Mark, and then there's the beginning of the chapter list for Luke. So that's pretty straightforward. And if we see that, it's what that implies is that when Codex Regius or Codex L was made, somewhere in its ancestry, maybe in the copy before, but back there somewhere, there were some copies that ended with the shorter ending, and some copies that ended with verses 9 to 20. So that's one of 6 copies in Greek that has the shorter ending. Now, in all 6 of those, they also include the continuation with Mark 16, 9 to 20. Qualification, some of them are damaged, and so they don't have the rest of the text. Some of them are very, very fragmentary.
Right.
That when they were pristine, they had the entire contents of verses 9 to 20.
So all 6 of these manuscripts would have had the shorter ending in there, and then appended after it the longer ending.
Well, there's one manuscript that's kind of medieval. It's probably one of the later manuscripts that has it, but it has Mark 16, 9 to 20 in the text, and then it has the shorter ending down in the lower margin. This is a manuscript 274, and you see in the text is Mark 16, 9 to 20, and in between it's kind of abbreviated, but what it means is this is the end of the second one of the readings to celebrate the resurrection, early morning Heothenon readings.
Right.
And then in the side margin, there's a note that says, here's the third one of those, and this is also the reading to be read on the resurrection, and here's the way to read it with the words, and Jesus added. They're in verse 9. So, but then in the lower margin, that's where we see the shorter ending, and it's just kind of noted by verse 8. There's an asterisk in the margin. I can't really see it because this is not a full color reproduction, but there's that asterisk that was meant to point out where this reading had been found. One of the interesting things that we see regarding the shorter ending and the Greek witnesses to it, of which there are only 6. Again, it's 6 for the shorter ending versus 1,600 for verses 9 to 20. But other than that, the thing to see is not just the number, but the connection between the witnesses, because these are not diverse witnesses. When we look at Greek Sahidic Lectionary 1602, we have evidence of a location where these witnesses came from. In Codex Psi, Codex 044, its note between the shorter ending and verses 9 to 20 is Estin Kai Tata Phenomena Metato Epomanogar. That's also found in the other, not in every single one, but in some of the other witnesses. There's also an unusual form of the text of Mark 16, 1669, where it's repeated in an unusual way. It's a unique presentation of the text.
Right.
If we dive into the weeds, we would see more of this connection that shows that these witnesses are connected to each other. But in Greek Sahidic Lectionary 1602, it has the same note. This again, like the Family One note that is shared by those witnesses, it's not randomly appearing here and there. It's specific to one particular group of manuscripts. But Greek Sahidic Lectionary 1602 shows us that it is connected to a particular locale. The shorter ending was not something that popped up in multiple locales. It was specific to Egypt. Now, it spread from Greek into other languages from Egypt, but at the point of origination, we have these elements converging. They're emanating from Egypt. And Egypt is not where the Gospel of Mark was sent to. We see support for Mark 16, 9 to 20. We see the patristic evidence. And when we see a Greek Sahidic Lectionary 1602, and we see its note there, we see it formatted in very similarly to what we see in Codex L. There's a connection there. It's a fingerprint at the crime scene, so to speak.
Right.
This is where it have to do with one specific transmission stream. The problem is that transmission stream was elevated to outweigh all others by Westcott and Hort back in 1881, and to many textual critics today, unfortunately, it still is elevated that way. The Alexandrian text is still elevated that way to the point where if you look at the text of the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament, or the UBS text, you will see, if you analyze the text in Matthew, in Mark, and Luke, and John, give me a chapter, and I will show you how Alexandrian it is versus how Byzantine is. For instance, also in Galatians, over and over again, the amount of Alexandrian readings is where the Alexandrian text and the Byzantine text disagree. How eclectic is it really? It's over 99% Alexandrian. The Byzantine text might be thrown in there like a player on the team who goes in when the quarterback breaks both legs. But But the Alexandrian text is the spare tire as far as, and you can look in some candid statements by Kurt Aland and Robert Aland. They readily acknowledge that we consider the Byzantine manuscripts irrelevant for purposes of textual criticism.
Right.
So, all the hype about an embarrassment of riches that Daniel Wallace will try to talk to people about.
It means nothing. Yeah.
He knows very well that to Kurt Aland, the Byzantine manuscripts were out the window by category.
And I mean that's like 85-90% of all the manuscripts that you've just dismissed.
Yes,
Kurt right off the bat,
candidly tells readers of the text of the Gospels. I've got it right here somewhere. He very candidly tells people, "No, we consider the Byzantine manuscripts to be irrelevant for purposes of textual criticism."
Right.
So whatever Dan Wallace is trying to say kind of collides with the reality of how Kurt Aland and company treated the text that comes to us in this compilation, which we find in English in the NIV, in the New American Standard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and the thing that gets me the most about the Byzantine family of manuscripts, right? And I mean, that's a pretty wide term. There's a number of subfamilies and stuff like this. This is just extremely simplified. But the Byzantine family came from somewhere, right? And you can't just dismiss the fact that it has progeny in the Western world, right? Like it had to come from somewhere. Instead, we rely, I say we, but instead textual criticism generally relies on these Alexandrian text-based manuscripts, which came out of Egypt. And from what I can see, none of the books that we have in the New Testament were addressed to the Egyptians. They were always addressed to the Greek-speaking world, whether it was, Paul's epistles to Philippi, the Colossae, the Corinthians, the Gospels being circulated amongst the Greek Empire. Like, this is where they originated from. So why is there no allowance for that? Why do we just cut everything off at the 5th century and say, oh, that's it?
Yes. Some folks say, well, where were the Byzantine manuscripts before the 300s?
Well, they brought it away.
They were written on papyrus, and papyrus was not magic. They brought it away.
It's not the arid climate of Egypt where they're preserved, right?
Yeah, we should not be surprised that in areas where it's impossible for papyrus to last a long time, what do we find? That it didn't last a long time. That doesn't mean it was using a text. The story that Hort would like for us to believe is that, well, after the 300s, the Byzantine text was simply made, and people just set aside the text that survived the persecutions and picked up this brand new text that nobody had seen before.
Right, and this is that whole recension deal, right? But to this day, there's no evidence of who did it and when, right? This is just their way of explaining where this massive Byzantine text type came from. When it seems to me the most clear thinking is that the Byzantine text came from something that was very close to the original autographs. There's no evidence at all that there's any sort of recension. There's no. I think Lucian might have been named as a potential recension goer.
But there's a comment that Jerome makes, but its interpretation is kind of up in the air. But But not to get off track, just look up in one of my videos that I have on YouTube in the course on New Testament text criticism. One of them focuses on the question of the Lucianic recension. So, so look there for more details about that. But I'd like to focus on the question of the range of support for Mark 16:9 to 20. Somebody might say, well, yeah, the Byzantine manuscripts, but we all know that those are all past the 1100s. Those are late, right? They're late. Well, okay, let's instead of arguing that their ancestry is still relevant, let's look at no witnesses beyond the time of the Roman Empire. So everything before 446. The patristic writers from before 486. So there's an emperor sitting on a throne somewhere while these guys lived and wrote. Epistula Apostolorum in the 100s. That's a very early source, and you can look at its framework, the framework of its narrative, and again, it's not super obvious, but there are scholars who can look at that like Robert Stein and say, well, this supports the ending of Mark, verses 9 to 20. Even people that don't themselves support Mark 9 to 20 have acknowledged that Epistula Apostolorum supports knowledge of that passage. Justin Martyr in First Apology, chapter 45, Tatian, Tatian, in what was called the Diatessaron, it was one continuous story of Jesus using material from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the Diatessaron. We don't have any copies of the Diatessaron directly, but in what's called the Arabic Diatessaron in the east, and also in Codex Valdensis, which is connected to the Diatessaron in the west, we have Mark 16:9 to 20 arranged very similarly. Also, Irenaeus, again, I mentioned Irenaeus, book 3, chapter 10, part 5. Irenaeus quotes Mark 16:19 very clearly. We also can have references, some clearer than others, but these are all on the list. And not all of these are in the Nestle-Aland apparatus. Tertullian, Hippolytus, Didascalia Apostolorum, Vincentius. You can just go down the list. If you see slide 16, you can see that the list of writers representing a diverse collection of locales where Mark 16:9 through 20 was in the text of the manuscripts that were used by the church. Aphrahat. Now we think, well, what are the Syriac texts? Well, Aphrahat uses some Diatessaron, but also uses some of the text where the genealogies are known. He's quoting from Mark 16:9 to 20. The Claromontanus catalog, when it lists the links of the books. Epiphanius, an apologist from the late 300s. Ambrose of Milan, another locale. Augustine in North Africa, he's using Mark 16:9 to 20. He also makes a reference to the Greek manuscripts when he's trying to clarify a point about Mark 16 verse 12. There's also a Macarius Magnes, an interesting witness I don't think gets enough attention. But Macarius Magnes is responding to an earlier writer, probably Hierocles, who was mentored by Porphyry. And as he's quoting this earlier writer, he quotes his jibe, but also doesn't say, oh, but it's not in some manuscripts. He answers along an entirely different line of reasoning.
Right. So essentially what you're saying is there is a lot of evidence amongst the early church fathers where they've either quoted directly or alluded to or indirectly quoted from the Gospel of Mark 16:9 through 20.
Over 40 patristic references use Mark 16:9 through 20 in one way.
Right.
They may not all be quoting the entire 12 verses, but they're quoting enough to show that it's in the text that they have in use. Everybody from Hippolytus to Leo the Great. You also have Patrick, way over in Ireland. He doesn't write a whole lot, but what he does write, he happens to use Mark 16:20, and not the Vulgate. It's an Old Latin text. So, in all of these writers, including Ephraim Cyrus in his commentary on the Diatessaron, Ephraim Cyrus also uses material from Mark 16:9 to 20. So it's stretching all the way from Ireland to Italy to Turkey, what we know as Turkey, into Syria, all the way into Armenia. Esnik of Golb quotes it long before any of our extant Greek manuscripts of Mark in Armenian. But Esnik of Golb, an Armenian, quotes Mark 16, 17 through 18. So if you mention Armenian manuscripts, but you don't mention Esnik of Golb, then you're not being equitable with the evidence. You're using false scales. But also Prosper of Aquitaine, Doctrine of Addai, Marcus Aramita, you can just go on and on and on.
Yeah.
Now, cautionary note, I'm afraid that many of the manuscripts that these people used have not survived. That doesn't mean they did not plainly exist.
That's right, yeah.
And to emphasize, the earliest manuscripts, all of these would be early manuscripts in the hands of the people that used them.
Yeah.
All of these manuscripts were early, very early, Roman Empire era early.
Yeah, and you can't discount them, right? Because they were at one point in existence, and we have testimony of people who have either seen it or used it, So how
many times do you see that footnoted in the Bible?
Never.
Footnotes? Never. You never see that. They never mention the patristic evidence. Why not?
And that's a really good question.
If they did, nobody would adopt their position about Mark 16 through 20. That's part of the reason why I'm trying to promote the evidence, just to put it out in the open. Partly because I want people to subscribe to my view, but also because I simply don't want scholars to just go like parrots and say things that are not true, or to say things that are so one-sided that it's ridiculous and silly to take them seriously. The evidence from the scribes, from those slides will speak for itself. If there's any other questions, people can contact me at the NT Textual Criticism group on Facebook, and also at my blog, thetextofthegospels.com.
Okay, and I'll be sure to leave that information in the description below. I'll have links to James's blog down below. In addition, I'll have a link to his Facebook group, NT Textual Criticism, and you can follow that and click the little join button. I don't think there's really any real filtering process going on. You just join and you're part of the group, and then you'll have a lot of wild discussion about biblical variants and the Greek New Testament. Okay, maybe it's not that crazy, but it's a lot of fun.
In the group, find your inner Viking and plunder the files. So there's lots of files that people find useful. Also on YouTube, for anyone that would like to test the waters of New Testament textual criticism, I have a 23 so far lecture series introducing folks to the methods, materials, and schools of thought in a New Testament textual criticism.
Good. And then when you mentioned plundering the files, your book, Authentic, The Case for Mark 16, 9 through 20, is also amongst the files. So you can get it there. It costs nothing if you get it from there. But if you get it from Amazon, I believe you can get an ebook version, and it's like super cheap. I think it's like $1 or something like that, right? So you're not in it for the money, clearly. So go download the book, read it. The stuff we're talking about here, it's in there, and you'll be well equipped to know the information in regards to Mark 16, 9 through 20. Now, I want to say this just in kind of closing. It's really interesting when we take a look at the ending of Mark. And despite all of the stuff that's going on surrounding it, and textual critic scholars questioning its authenticity, it still finds its way in our Bibles. So even though there's little footnotes, the text is still there. And I think it's God's providence that has allowed that text to just stay there, regardless of what the main textual critical scholars say. Of course, with all that being said, I don't want to demonize the scholars either, because they do a tremendous amount of good work. They just missed it on this point, right? So we don't want to knock them out entirely and say, no, we shouldn't do any scholarly work. Far from it. So despite where they are and where they land with Mark 16, 9 through 20, it's not a salvation issue. Our salvation isn't dependent on it. We're not damned or going to hell or anything like that for our views on this specific passage. But it is God's word. It is important, and it is certainly something to look into. So, James, I want to thank you very much for coming on my channel. And as the expert on Mark 16, 9 through 20, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
All right, brothers and sisters, until next time, we'll see you around.